The fluorescent lights hummed above me, steady and indifferent, as I stood in front of the county courthouse doors. 4 months ago, my parents had filed a petition claiming I was incapable of managing my life, my money, my apartment, everything I'd built quietly over more than a decade. And now, in 3 days, the courtroom would decide my autonomy. I paused, hand on the brass door handle, imagining my father's jaw tight, my mother's handkerchief damp, their lawyer's smirk. All of them convinced that this was a formality, that the girl who sorted paper in a basement job could never outmaneuver a lifetime of parental certainty. It wasn't fear that made my stomach twist. It was the memory of every subtle manipulation, every dinner table correction, every whispered warning I'd swallowed for years. But I had prepared. The notebooks, the spreadsheets, the tax records, the Vanguard statements, they were all lined up, each page a quiet assertion that the life I'd built was mine. And for the first time in years, I felt calm. Not reckless, not vindictive, calm. If this story already feels like it might resonate with you, go ahead and click subscribe. Not for me, for you. To remember that boundaries matter, and strength doesn't always roar. I returned home that night, a Tuesday, and set the petition on the kitchen counter next to the notebook I'd kept for 11 years. Dates, account numbers, purchase prices, rental incomes, all meticulously updated. Each line was proof that I had managed my life with precision and discipline, despite what Gerald Wallace and Donna Wallace wanted the court to believe. 3 hours later, I called Rachel Peaton. Calm, direct, experienced. "We'll need an independent investigator, full asset disclosure, and a forensic audit," she said. I nodded, letting her words sink in. Each step was a shield, each document a barrier against the world that had tried to erase me. The next morning, I pulled my credit report. Everything clean except for 2 accounts I hadn't opened and a HELOC forged in my name. My parents had already tried to steal $341,600. I didn't panic. I sat, recorded every detail, screenshots ready, a plan in motion. The moment would come, and I would be ready. If you've ever had someone underestimate you completely, if you've ever felt your autonomy threatened, subscribe now. Stand here with me. This is about quiet strength. That evening, I sat in the dim light of my studio, fingers tracing the spreadsheets, heart steady, mind alert. The fight wasn't about anger, it was about reclaiming what was mine. And in 3 days, the bailiff would read those numbers aloud. Every dollar accounted for. Every lie exposed. Thea Wallace. That's what I kept telling myself as I walked up the courthouse steps the next morning. Not the girl who sorts paper. Not the daughter who can't manage money. Just me. Fully capable, fully prepared, fully present. My hands gripped the leather strap of the folder holding the 40 pages Rachel and I had compiled the evidence, meticulously documented. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and industrial cleaner. Empty chairs waited, fluorescent lights buzzed, and the gallery, sparse, seemed to stretch the silence. Gerald Wallace was already there, posture perfect, jaw tight, eyes sharp. Donna Wallace clutched her handkerchief like it was a talisman, rehearsed grief painted on her face. Their lawyer, Craig Delmore, glanced at me briefly, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. They thought the script was theirs. I slid into the chair beside Rachel. She nodded, calm, knowing. Her presence was a reminder. I wasn't stepping in alone. Ethan had called last night from his dorm, promising he would be at the courthouse if needed. I smiled faintly at the thought my brother, quiet, thoughtful, standing with me. It felt like a shield I hadn't realized I'd needed until that moment. Rachel whispered, just enough for me to hear. "The investigator's report first, numbers next. Let the documents do the talking." I exhaled, steady. This was the part where patience mattered. Years of careful saving, note-taking, learning the financial language, all would converge here. I'd learned long ago that quiet accumulation of knowledge, of assets, of integrity, often speaks louder than shouting. If you're listening and you know what it's like to be underestimated, hit subscribe now. This isn't about spectacle, it's about being seen, being prepared, being ready when your life depends on it. Minutes stretched. Gerald tapped his fingers on the table, rhythmic, certain. The same rhythm I'd watched since childhood, a silent metronome of his belief that authority always wins. But I had the rhythm of truth in my hands now. Margaret Holt's guidance, Rachel's strategy, 11 years of disciplined investments, all of it a quiet but immovable force. I thought about the HELOC, the forged credit cards, $341,600 taken without my knowledge. That was motivation. Yes, but also clarity. Not revenge. Justice through facts. I set my fingers lightly on the folder, feeling the weight of it, the weight of my autonomy. As the bailiff called the courtroom to order, a strange calm settled over me. This wasn't a story about anger. It was about boundaries, preparation, and finally being heard. And for anyone watching this story unfold, take a moment now, subscribe, and stay here. This is where quiet strength lives, and sometimes it is all you need to change everything. I arrived at Department 7:30 minutes before the hearing, careful to wear a light blue button-up, dark slacks, and flat shoes, the uniform of someone who blends into the courthouse walls rather than demands attention. The folder, heavy with 40 pages of carefully tabbed documents, rested on my lap as Rachel reviewed our plan one last time. Her voice was calm, unhurried, every word a precise instruction. Start with the investigator's report, then the asset disclosure, then the forensic audit. Let the facts speak, she reminded me. Across the room, Gerald Wallace sat rigid, fingers drumming against the polished surface, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the clock. Beside him, Donna's handkerchief moved in measured intervals, rehearsed grief unfolding like a performance she had perfected over decades. Craig Delmore tapped his Mont Blanc pen lightly against the laptop, already poised to narrate a life he had decided for me without ever asking. They believed the script was theirs. They were wrong. I glanced at Rachel. She didn't need to look at me. We'd rehearsed this in every detail, accounted for every document, every possible question. My heart was steady, my hands rested on the folder. 11 years of meticulously tracked investments, rental properties I had bought and managed myself, and a carefully maintained Vanguard portfolio, all converged in this single moment. It was quiet power, the kind that doesn't demand attention until it is unavoidable. When the bailiff called the courtroom to order, a hush fell over the room. Judge Robert Callahan, known for fairness and zero tolerance for wasted time, took the bench, scanning the parties with the measured authority that had earned him respect for decades. I sat up straighter, letting my posture reflect the quiet confidence I felt but did not yet show. This wasn't about revenge, it was about clarity, boundaries, and facts. Craig Delmore began his opening, presenting Gerald and Donna's affidavits. Gerald's controlled concern, Donna's emotional appeal, letters from Aunt Barbara and a former neighbor, all constructed to paint me as isolated, incapable, and unfit. I listened without flinching, fingers lightly pressed to the folder. Every lie they recited, every omission, only underscored the precision of the work Rachel and I had compiled. Minutes passed. Gerald leaned forward slightly, whispering to Delmore, fingers still tapping, the rhythm of certainty ingrained over decades. I let the silence settle around me, a counterpoint to their narrative. I didn't speak. I didn't react. I simply waited, folder at the ready, knowing that when the court began reading our documents, the truth would arrive with the weight of years of careful, quiet preparation. Outside, the hallway was still. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed, and in that small, ordinary room, the stage was set for the moment the bailiff would start reading, beginning with the report that would expose everything they thought they had controlled. The bailiff cleared his throat, and the courtroom settled into a silence that felt almost tangible. Rachel nudged the folder slightly toward me, a quiet reminder. Start with the investigator's report. I opened it carefully, letting the yellow tabs line up perfectly with the edge of the page. Each tab represented months of meticulous work, every bank statement, every investment ledger, every rental property record. This was not just paperwork. It was my life in print. Linda Marsh's report was first. She had spent 90 minutes in my studio, asking about my routine, my finances, my social life, and observing the space I inhabited. Clean counters, a made bed, bills organized in a folder, books on the shelf arranged half financial, half literary. She noted that I demonstrated full cognitive capacity, consistent employment history, and no indicators of impaired judgment. She confirmed what I had lived daily, that I managed my life with precision, discipline, and care. As the clerk read her summary aloud, Gerald's fingers stilled for the first time that morning. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing, as though searching for a mistake in a report that had already been completed. Donna dabbed at her eyes less frequently, her scripted performance faltering under the weight of evidence. Craig Delmore's Mont Blanc pen hovered midair, A pause heavy with disbelief. Rachel whispered under her breath, "Next, the asset disclosure." I nodded, feeling the quiet intensity settle in my chest. For 11 years, I had built this quietly 3 rental properties. A studio I loved, a Honda Civic, a disciplined investment account. They had never asked, never noticed, never imagined the depth of planning and patience behind the life I had maintained. The bailiff's voice read each property, each account, each figure slowly, deliberately, as though the numbers themselves carried authority. One by one, the details emerged. Elm Court, Prospect Avenue, Cedar Lane, all purchased at auction or below market, now fully appraised. Each investment verified independently, every rental income calculated. The total was undeniable. The girl who sorts paper, the one they claimed was incapable, had quietly built nearly $2 million in assets and financial stability. I felt a faint pulse of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Validation. Not triumph. Not revenge. Just clarity. This was the power of preparation, of attention to detail, of patience. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The facts themselves were enough. Gerald leaned back, disbelief flickering across his face. Donna's handkerchief slipped from her fingers, forgotten on her lap. For the first time, the narrative was no longer theirs. And then Rachel gave me the briefest glance. The final piece, the forensic audit, the identity theft, the fraudulent HELOC and credit cards was ready. The moment when the numbers would expose not just incompetence, but deliberate manipulation. The courtroom held its collective breath, unaware that it was about to witness the full weight of truth, quiet and undeniable. The bailiff's voice paused for a moment, then turned the page to the supplemental exhibit, the forensic audit. My stomach tightened not from fear, but from the weight of knowing the truth was finally going to be seen. Rachel leaned back slightly, a calm presence, letting me watch as Gerald's fingers stopped tapping entirely. This was the evidence he hadn't anticipated. The auditor's report, prepared by Hargrove and Dunn, spelled it out in precise, clinical detail. Between January of the previous year and September of the current year, Gerald and Donna Wallace had executed unauthorized financial transactions, totaling $341,600, 2 credit cards, opened without my consent, a home equity line of credit drawn against my second rental property using a revoked power of attorney, complete with a forged signature. Additional withdrawals, transfers, and fees meticulously documented. Every transaction tied directly to them. The clerk read each finding slowly, deliberately, letting the numbers land in the room like stones thrown into still water. $28,400 for the credit cards. $85,000, HELOC. $228,200 in additional unauthorized withdrawals and fees. Every dollar accounted for. Every fraudulent action traced to the people who had claimed they were only concerned for me. Gerald's jaw tightened. He leaned forward as if he could physically absorb the numbers and make them disappear. Donna's face drained of color, the handkerchief now forgotten on her lap. Craig Delmore's pen hovered above his pad, uncapped, then slowly capped again. The carefully constructed narrative that I was incapable, isolated, unfit was collapsing with each line read aloud. I sat still, hands folded in my lap, letting the room absorb the magnitude of the report. 11 years of quiet planning, disciplined investments, careful tracking, and meticulous documentation had built a defense that could not be disputed. My life, the life they tried to seize, was laid out in black and white, numbers and evidence that could not be argued away. Rachel's eyes met mine briefly, steady, encouraging. We had built this moment together. Every late night updating spreadsheets, every call to Margaret Holt, every document notarized and verified, it all led here. The courtroom, silent now, was the first place the truth had real weight. Judge Callahan removed his glasses slowly, scanning the audit, then looking at Gerald and Donna. The room was quiet, thick with anticipation. Gerald's confident posture had crumbled into disbelief. He realized, finally, that control had slipped from his grasp, not through drama, not through shouting, but through the quiet accumulation of facts, of preparation, of discipline, and for the first time that morning, I allowed myself to notice it. The air itself had shifted. The script was no longer theirs. The evidence, the life I had quietly built, was speaking louder than any performance they could muster. The courtroom remained quiet, heavy with the weight of the forensic audit. Gerald and Donna Wallace were still processing the numbers, their carefully rehearsed performance crumbling. Rachel gave me a brief nod, and I felt the familiar calm of preparation settling over me. This was the moment our plan had led to, but there was one final piece that would leave no room for doubt. A door opened quietly, and Ethan stepped in. 20 years old, hoodie and jeans, backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked exhausted, like he had ridden a bus through the night, but his gaze found mine instantly. A small nod passed between us, the kind that said, "We're in this together." Gerald's eyes flicked up, confusion mixing with irritation. "What is he doing here?" he muttered under his breath. Rachel rose, her voice steady. "Your Honor, the respondent has an additional witness." Ethan walked forward to the stand, calm but firm. Judge Callahan gestured for him to be seated, his expression unreadable, professional. Ethan began, voice low but clear. "1 week ago, I overheard my father speaking on the phone with his attorney. I was in the kitchen of our family home, and he didn't know I was there." He paused, letting the court absorb that. He said, and I quote, "The girls probably got 30-40 grand in the bank. Once the conservatorship goes through, I sell her car and the apartment lease, and we restructure." The courtroom shifted. Gerald's jaw tightened, fingers gripping the armrests. Donna's hand hovered over her lap, frozen. Craig Delmore's pen was paused midair, his eyes darting between Ethan and Gerald. Ethan continued. He referred to Thea as the girl and said, "Just get me the signature. She's not going to fight it." I recorded the conversation. It's 18 minutes long, and it confirms that the petition isn't about concern, it's about money. A faint murmur ran through the courtroom, quickly silenced by the judge's gaze. Gerald's face lost the last trace of composure. He looked around as if searching for an escape, the authority he had wielded for decades suddenly meaningless. Donna's shoulders slumped, the carefully maintained image of grief and control dissolved. I sat with my hands folded, calm, letting the truth land fully. 11 years of silent preparation, every ledger, every spreadsheet, every rental record, and now this recording, it was undeniable. The courtroom wasn't swayed by theatrics, by cries, or by smirks. It responded to evidence, and the truth was loud enough to drown out everything Gerald and Donna had tried to orchestrate. Judge Callahan adjusted his glasses, scanning Ethan briefly, then glancing at the parents, the attorney, and the auditor's reports on the bench. The air was thick with a quiet realization. The narrative Gerald had believed was his to control was finished. The story that mattered was finally unfolding, and it was mine. Judge Callahan removed his glasses slowly, placing them on the bench with deliberate precision. The courtroom was still, every eye fixed on him. Gerald's confident posture had crumbled into disbelief. Donna's handkerchief lay forgotten, and Craig Delmore's Mont Blanc pen had been capped, hovering uselessly over a legal pad. The evidence, the investigator's report, the asset disclosure, the forensic audit, and now Ethan's recording was undeniable. The judge began, his voice measured but firm. "The court has reviewed the materials submitted, including the report of the court-appointed investigator, Miss Linda Marsh. The investigator personally evaluated the respondent, Miss Thea Wallace, in her residence. Findings indicate full cognitive capacity, responsible financial management, organized living conditions, and no clinical markers of impaired judgment or executive dysfunction." Gerald's fingers twitched. He opened his mouth as if to interrupt, but the judge's gaze stopped him. "Mr. Wallace, please refrain from commentary. The court is considering the facts presented." Rachel placed her hand lightly on my folder, not to guide me, but to remind me of the strategy we had rehearsed. I nodded subtly, remaining still. I didn't need to speak. The facts would speak for themselves. The judge continued, turning to the psychological evaluations submitted by Gerald and Donna. "The report authored by Dr. Howard Phelps, submitted in support of the petitioners, contains no record of direct examination of the respondent. It appears to rely entirely on descriptions provided by family members. This raises significant ethical and evidentiary concerns. The court does not consider this report sufficient to establish incapacity." Donna's eyes widened, her scripted tears replaced by genuine shock. Gerald's jaw tightened, the first crack in the facade of certainty he had worn for decades. The air shifted. The courtroom, which had been weighted with anticipation, now carried the unmistakable texture of truth. Judge Callahan leaned forward slightly, voice low but deliberate. "The petition for conservatorship over Miss Thea Wallace is denied. There is no credible evidence that she lacks capacity for self-care or financial management. To the contrary, the evidence demonstrates exceptional financial competence, organizational skills, and consistent judgment in both personal and professional matters. For the first time in that room, Gerald and Donna were unguarded. Gerald's fingers, usually a metronome of control, rested limply on the table. Donna sat motionless, processing a reality that had finally escaped her manipulation. Craig Delmore's expression flickered between disbelief and silent calculation. I stayed seated, hands on my lap, breathing steady. 11 years of careful planning, silent investment, and meticulous documentation had culminated in this quiet, undeniable vindication. The courtroom didn't erupt in applause. It didn't need to. The truth, stated plainly, had dismantled the false narrative and established a boundary no one could ignore. Judge Callahan paused, letting his words settle over the room. The story Gerald had tried to write for me was finished. The real story, the one of preparation, discipline, and quiet resilience, was finally being recognized in full. The bailiff cleared his throat and turned to the first tab of the folder. Asset item 1, he began, voice level and deliberate. My heart thumped quietly, not from fear, but from the anticipation of finally letting the numbers speak. The first section detailed my Vanguard Total Stock Market Index Fund and associated brokerage accounts, held solely in my name. The clerk read the verified balance as of the end of October, $1,214,812. The courtroom didn't gasp. Instead, a heavy silence settled, tangible in its weight. Gerald's head jerked slightly, as though the number had physically struck him. His eyes narrowed, then widened. Donna's handkerchief slipped from her fingers onto her lap, forgotten. Craig Delmore froze mid-note, pen hovering, unable to adjust the narrative that had already begun to unravel. The bailiff moved on to asset item 2, the 3 residential rental properties. He read each address, purchase price, and current appraised value. Elm Court, bought at a tax lien auction for $23,000, now valued at $185,000. Prospect Avenue, purchased 5 years ago for $61,000, current value $340,000. Cedar Lane, a duplex purchased 3 years ago for $92,000, now appraised at $365,000. The combined annual rental income, $39,600. I watched Gerald. His body, usually rigid, seemed to lose coordination as each property was announced. The reality of what I had built, quietly, methodically, far surpassed anything he had imagined. For years, he had referred to me as a girl who sorted paper in a basement. And here, in front of the judge, the numbers refuted every word he had ever spoken. Donna's face shifted in subtle increments, confusion and disbelief overtaking the performance she had rehearsed for decades. Aunt Barbara, seated in the gallery, leaned forward slightly, hands flat on her lap, as if trying to reconcile what she had been told with the unvarnished facts. Craig Delmore's eyes flicked from the page to Gerald, silent calculation battling with incredulity. The bailiff's voice, calm and measured, moved to the third tab, the supplemental forensic audit. The moment we had waited for, the piece that would expose the fraud, identity theft, and misuse of a revoked power of attorney, was about to be read. Gerald leaned forward instinctively, as if trying to intercept the numbers before they landed. But there was no intercepting. The truth had weight, and it was already in motion. I remained still, hands folded in my lap, eyes steady. The documents were speaking. Every investment, every property, every spreadsheet meticulously maintained over 11 years was asserting itself, and the narrative my parents had tried to construct was cracking under its own falsehood. The room waited. The world, at that moment, paused for the facts. The bailiff turned to the third tab, the supplemental document, the independent forensic audit. The room seemed to hold its breath. I rested my hands lightly on the folder, letting the gravity of the evidence fill the space. Rachel sat beside me, posture calm, expression neutral. I didn't need to speak. I didn't need to react. The facts would do the work. Findings, the bailiff began, voice even, deliberate. Between January of the previous year and September of the current year, Gerald R. Wallace and Donna M. Wallace executed unauthorized financial transactions totaling $341,600 using the personal identifying information of the respondent, Thea L. Wallace. A faint, involuntary exhale escaped Gerald. Donna's fingers froze over her lap. Craig Delmore's pen hovered, then was slowly capped again. The numbers were undeniable. The bailiff continued. Transactions include 2 credit card accounts opened via identity fraud. Combined balance $28,400. 1 home equity line of credit drawn against respondent's second rental property, $85,000, obtained using a revoked power of attorney, with forged signature. He paused slightly, letting it settle. Additional unauthorized withdrawals, balance transfers, and associated fees total $228,200. Total exposure, $341,600. Gerald's hands gripped the armrests, knuckles white. For a man accustomed to control, to absolute certainty, the room's silence amplified every dollar read aloud. Donna's mouth opened slightly, as if to protest, but no words emerged. Her carefully orchestrated performance of concern had dissolved into disbelief. I remained still, heart steady. 11 years of methodical planning, every bank statement, investment ledger, and rental record, all validated, now backed up by the forensic audit. Rachel gave me the slightest nod, confirmation that patience, preparation, and evidence had brought us to this exact moment. Judge Callahan adjusted his glasses, scanning the report, then the parents. Gerald leaned forward slightly, whispering to Delmore. Craig's eyes flicked to the audit, then back at Gerald, and finally to the judge. The control they had assumed for decades, the certainty that authority could bend truth, was no longer theirs. The bailiff finished reading the page. Silence hung in the courtroom, thick and tangible. Gerald and Donna were frozen, confronted not by rhetoric, not by accusation, but by documents, by numbers, by meticulously verified truth. Each line a testament to my discipline, my preparation, my quiet persistence over the years. I looked across the aisle at Rachel. Her expression said what words never could: we had done it. The narrative my parents had tried to impose of incompetence, isolation, incapacity was utterly dismantled, and the person who had been underestimated her whole life, the girl who sorts paper, had done exactly what she had planned. She had let the numbers speak, and they shouted louder than any performance of grief or authority could. The courtroom was still, thick with the quiet weight of truth. Gerald's jaw clenched as he stared down at the folder, the figures he had assumed he could manipulate now glowing in black and white. Donna's hand hovered uselessly over her lap, the handkerchief abandoned, her performance stripped bare. Craig Delmore's confidence had evaporated. His pen lay capped, unmoving, as if frozen by the reality unfolding before him. Judge Callahan removed his glasses slowly, scanning each page of the audit, and then looking at Gerald and Donna. His voice, calm but deliberate, cut through the tension. This court has reviewed the evidence, including the forensic audit prepared by Hargrove and Dunn, which clearly documents unauthorized financial activity totaling $341,600. The court considers these actions identity theft and financial fraud, executed using the respondent's personal identifying information without consent. Gerald's hands trembled slightly. He leaned forward, attempting to speak, but the judge's gaze pinned him. Mr. Wallace, one more word and you will be held in contempt. Sit down. Gerald froze. The authority he had wielded for decades rendered meaningless by the meticulous truth laid out before him. The judge continued, addressing both parents directly. Mr. and Mrs. Wallace, you are not to leave this county until further notice. The full record of this proceeding, along with the forensic audit and supporting documentation, will be transmitted to the district attorney for criminal investigation. This court finds sufficient evidence of identity theft, financial fraud, and misuse of a revoked power of attorney to warrant formal inquiry. Donna's face drained of color. She muttered something under her breath, a feeble attempt at justification that went unheard. Gerald's lips moved, but no words escaped. The control he had believed was absolute was gone. Security officers quietly stationed themselves near the doors, their presence a reminder that authority in this room now belonged to the law, not to a man who had built his life on intimidation. I remained seated, hands folded neatly in my lap. The folder between Rachel and me had done its work. 11 years of savings, investments, property, and careful documentation were not just numbers on paper, they were proof. Proof that autonomy, preparation, and quiet diligence could withstand even the most invasive attempt to seize control. Ethan, standing just behind Rachel, looked at me with a faint nod. His presence was more than support, it was affirmation. Together, the truth had been presented, and the court had recognized it. Gerald's expression shifted subtly, from disbelief to a strange, hollow resignation. Judge Callahan's voice lowered, deliberate, final. This hearing is concluded. The petition for conservatorship is denied. All evidence of criminal activity will proceed under the jurisdiction of the district attorney. The court's decision is not open to negotiation. I exhaled quietly, feeling a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying lift, slowly, imperceptibly. The courtroom lights buzzed overhead, indifferent, continuing their work just as the law had now continued its work, firm, impartial, and undeniable. The granite hallway outside Department 7 felt impossibly long as I walked toward the exit, folder in hand, Rachel at my side, Ethan 2 steps behind. Each echo of our footsteps bounced back from the stone floor, marking time in a way that made the past 11 years feel simultaneously distant and immediate. The hearing was over. The conservatorship denied. The forensic audit had spoken. And yet, I felt a quiet weight still in my chest, the weight of everything we had endured to get here. Then I heard him. Gerald Wallace, coming up fast, Donna trailing behind. His suit jacket was unbuttoned, tie loose, and the rigid composure that had defined him for decades had collapsed entirely. He approached with a mix of authority and desperation that I had never seen before. "You need to drop this," he said, voice controlled but strained. "Tell your lawyer to pull it back. I am your father." Rachel positioned herself subtly but firmly between us. Her presence was quiet authority, a reminder that boundaries existed in both law and reality. "Mr. Wallace," she said evenly, "my client is under no obligation to speak with you. I strongly advise maintaining distance." Gerald ignored her, eyes locked on me. "You don't understand. Mom is sick over this. I'm carrying debt you can't imagine. You're our daughter, this is your obligation." I stopped walking and faced him fully for the first time that day. Calm, steady, unshaken. "Dad," I said, voice quiet but firm. "I've already said no. I'll say it again in court. You tried to take what isn't yours. You tried to manipulate everyone around me. That ends now." He flinched slightly, disbelief flickering across his face. Ethan stepped forward then, his voice low but unwavering. "Stop. Nobody is manipulating me. You did this yourself." His eyes met mine, a silent affirmation that the past years of quiet vigilance, preparation, and patience had not gone unnoticed. Donna reached for my arm, trembling. "Thea, please," she whispered. I felt her fingers graze my sleeve, cold and shaky, but I didn't move toward her. I didn't need to. "Mom," I said, measured, "your apology doesn't undo $341,600 in unauthorized transactions in my name. You need a lawyer now, not me." I turned back toward the glass doors, sunlight spilling in, bathing the granite in pale gold. Rachel flanked me, Ethan just behind. No words, no shouting, no dramatic gestures. Just a clear, enforceable line drawn. The boundary was no longer symbolic. It was real, legal, and absolute. As I stepped through the doors, the weight lifted slowly, imperceptibly. The halls, the courthouse, the 11 years of preparation, all had led to this quiet clarity. Gerald and Donna remained behind, staring after us, their authority stripped to its core. I didn't look back. There was nothing there I needed anymore. The ride home was quiet. Ethan sat in the back of my Honda Civic, backpack resting on the seat beside him, eyes scanning the familiar streets that now felt strange and new. The studio apartment awaited us, small, unassuming, entirely mine. I'd spent years building a life no one in my family had noticed, yet here, finally, it was acknowledged, untouchable. When I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the smell of clean air and faintly worn carpet greeted me. I set the folder carefully on the kitchen counter and sank onto the single chair. Ethan dropped his backpack to the floor, sitting cross-legged on the hardwood. "You live here?" he asked, half in disbelief, half amusement. I smiled faintly. "Yes, the studio, the Honda, everything in this folder, all of it." I tapped the folder, the pages inside heavy with years of planning, spreadsheets, investment records, and property deeds. All mine, built quietly, slowly, without anyone noticing. He leaned back against the wall, head tilted, studying me. "I knew Dad was..." His voice faltered, then steadied. "I knew what he was like, what he could do, but I didn't know how much you'd done on your own." This. He gestured vaguely at the folder. The apartment. Me. It's amazing. I exhaled slowly, the tension of the courthouse fading. It wasn't about showing him, it was about me. Every rental, every Vanguard statement, every careful ledger was mine to protect, regardless of what he thought. We sat together on the floor, 2 glasses of water from the tap between us, paper plates for the leftover pizza Ethan had brought. No ceremony, no words about triumph, just presence. I began explaining, quietly, step by step, how I had started with the small Vanguard account, how I reinvested dividends, tracked every property, balanced every spreadsheet. Ethan listened intently, asking questions, learning not for approval, but to understand. For the first time in years, I felt the apartment expand not physically, but in a way that made space for freedom. The small kitchen, the single chair, the worn sofa, they weren't constraints. They were proof of choice, of autonomy, of life built intentionally, without interference. Ethan laughed softly, the sound real and unguarded. "You're incredible," he said. "I mean, I knew you were smart, but this," he gestured at the room again. "All of this, and you lived here? Quietly?" I chuckled, leaning back, feeling the weight of relief and clarity. "Yes, quietly. That's the point." The apartment felt right-sized, enough for us to sit, talk, breathe, and plan. For the first time, the world outside the courthouse didn't feel threatening. It felt possible, safe, contained within boundaries I had set and finally defended. After the quiet meal, Ethan sprawled on the floor with his notebook, asking questions about investments and properties. I pulled the folder from the counter and laid it open between us, pointing to the carefully tracked Vanguard statements, property deeds, and the forensic audit. "Everything we've done so far proves ownership," I said. "But proof isn't always enough. We need safeguards, structures that can't be manipulated." He leaned forward, curiosity replacing the cautious restraint he'd learned around Gerald. "Like what?" I traced a finger down a page listing rental incomes and mortgage payments. "Credit freezes on all accounts, change locks, passwords, PINs, everything verified in person. If someone tries to access anything in my name, it triggers alerts to me and my attorney immediately. We make it impossible for unauthorized transactions to occur." Ethan nodded slowly. "So even if Dad or anyone else tried something, it wouldn't work?" "Exactly." I smiled faintly. "Not for triumph, but for clarity. Boundaries are about protection, not punishment. We're not trying to hurt anyone. We're making sure what's mine, what's yours, stays safe. That's freedom. That's control over our lives." He scribbled notes in his notebook, nodding thoughtfully. "And the studio? The houses? Everything stays like this?" "Yes," I said, closing the folder lightly. "All the properties, accounts, everything verified, documented, protected. We're not just responding to what they did, we're preventing it from ever happening again." The conversation drifted to routines, small practicalities, and possibilities for the future. We talked about how to maintain the Vanguard account, when to reinvest dividends, and what to do with the rental properties if we wanted to live in one ourselves. The discussion was quiet, technical, and ordinary, but it carried the weight of autonomy finally reclaimed. I realized something as Ethan asked about potential mistakes he might make. The freedom we were building wasn't just financial. It was psychological. For the first time, we could make decisions without fear of surveillance, manipulation, or coercion. Every spreadsheet, every audit, every precaution was a line drawn in the sand, a boundary that was both legal and personal. Ethan looked up, eyes bright. "You know, for years, I felt like I had to tiptoe around Dad. But now," he shrugged, a small smile forming, "it feels like we can just exist, make our choices without worrying about him." I leaned back against the wall, sipping water, letting the realization settle. Yes, that was exactly it. Autonomy, boundaries, self-determination quietly defended, finally recognized. Not through revenge, not through anger, but through patience, preparation, and clarity. For the first time in years, the apartment didn't feel small. It felt like home, a place where decisions were ours, and freedom wasn't theoretical, it was lived, one choice at a time. The following morning, I woke early, feeling a rare sense of quiet control. The apartment was bathed in pale light, and for the first time, I could sit at my kitchen counter without glancing over my shoulder. Rachel had advised the next steps, the final measures to ensure the boundaries we had fought for would hold. New locks, a new phone number, and a complete credit freeze across all 3 bureaus. I started with the locks. Each door clicked into place with precision, the sound almost ceremonial. The physical barrier was simple, tangible, something Gerald or Donna could not bypass. It was the first layer of protection, reinforcing what the law now acknowledged. My autonomy was no longer negotiable. Next, the phone. I set up a new number, carefully shared only with Rachel and Ethan. The old one went offline, a symbolic closing of channels they had once used to manipulate, to guilt, to threaten. Every buzz of my phone would now be intentional, controlled, mine. Ethan helped me with the credit freezes. We logged into each bureau, followed the steps methodically, confirming my identity and locking down every account. The process felt almost surreal. 11 years of preparation, months of evidence, and now the final shield. No fraudulent account could be opened in my name without triggering multiple alerts. The past could no longer reach me. Sitting back against the kitchen wall, I felt a weight lift slowly, deliberately. This wasn't triumph, not in the theatrical sense. It was something quieter, the certainty that boundaries I had longed for were finally enforceable. My life, my choices, my labor and discipline legally and physically secured. Ethan watched me, eyes bright. "Feels different," he said quietly. "Like, the world is ours to manage now," I nodded. "Exactly. Not because we want revenge, because we deserve protection, clarity, and freedom." For the first time in years, the apartment felt expansive. The worn sofa, the single chair, even the narrow kitchen counter, it all belonged to me, wholly and irreversibly. Every ledger, every spreadsheet, every rental property, every account, all safeguarded, documented, verified. I glanced at Ethan, who had returned to his notebook, and realized the most profound part. Freedom wasn't just legal, it was mental. It was knowing the line was drawn, the boundaries respected, and that no one could cross it without consequence. I had learned to defend my life with patience, discipline, and attention to detail. Now, those defenses were concrete. I sat quietly, sipping water from the tap, letting the apartment settle around me. The past months of fear, tension, and preparation were behind me. Ahead lay autonomy, choice, and clarity. And for the first time in over a decade, I could breathe without calculation, knowing that what was mine, truly mine, was finally safe. The apartment felt different that evening. The sunlight slanted through the narrow window, painting pale rectangles on the floor. Ethan sprawled on the sofa, notebook open, jotting down numbers and ideas as if he were drafting a plan for the future. I leaned against the kitchen counter, a cup of espresso warming my hands, letting the calm finally settle around me. "You know," Ethan said, looking up, "I never imagined this would happen. I mean, not just the court, but us. You actually did it. You built all of this quietly and no one knew." I smiled, small and reflective. That's the thing about patience. Quiet work accumulates. Numbers grow, investments compound, properties appreciate. It doesn't make noise until it matters, until someone tries to take what isn't theirs. He nodded thoughtfully. "So, what now? The studio, the properties, everything's secure. But do you ever think about a new place for yourself? Somewhere that's yours, not just an investment?" I tapped the folder lightly, a reminder of what had been built, maintained, and protected. "Yes, I've thought about it. Something with a bigger kitchen, a yard maybe, a place to actually live in and not just manage. But it has to be on my terms. That's the lesson here. Freedom isn't just about money. It's about choice, control, and boundaries." Ethan leaned back, a faint smile on his face. "Boundaries, huh? Feels good to finally see them in action. The court, the locks, the credit freezes. It's like you've made the world respect your space." I nodded. "Exactly. And you'll need the same lessons, little brother. Investments, records, attention to detail. Freedom doesn't come from luck. It comes from care, discipline, and protecting what matters before someone else can claim it." He grinned, scribbling more notes in his notebook. "Step 1, open a Vanguard account, right?" "Step 1, I agreed, smiling. "And step 2, don't tell Dad." We laughed softly, a quiet sound that filled the apartment in a way it hadn't in years. Not loud or theatrical, just simple relief and connection. I realized then, that this was another layer of freedom, the ability to share knowledge, to mentor, to create safety for the next generation without fear of interference. We spent the evening mapping possibilities, when to reinvest dividends, how to maintain rental properties, even imagining the kind of apartment or house that would finally feel like home. The studio no longer felt limiting. It was a base, a quiet command center from which we could build the next chapter. By the time night fell, the air felt lighter. The apartment, the documents, the system of protections, they were all aligned. And for the first time in over a decade, I allowed myself to imagine a future that belonged wholly to me, shared only with those I trusted, and lived on terms I had defined. The apartment was quiet that night, the faint hum of the radiator the only sound accompanying my thoughts. I sank into the chair by the window, watching the streetlights flicker across the worn pavement. For years, Gerald and Donna Wallace had defined the contours of my life, what I could do, where I could live, even how I should feel. Every choice I'd made had been weighed against their expectations, their authority, their invisible scripts. But now, sitting here, the folder of documents at my side, I felt the magnitude of what had changed. They no longer had that power. Every fraudulent transaction had been traced, every asset verified, every threat neutralized by law. The conservatorship petition denied. Identity theft exposed. Credit cards closed. Locks changed. Phone numbers new. Credit freezes in place. Boundaries weren't just paper, they were lived reality. Ethan, curled on the sofa, was asleep with his notebook still open beside him. Watching him, I realized that part of my fight had been for him as well. He no longer had to tiptoe, second-guess, or internalize the weight of their authority. He could exist in his life without fear of interference, just as I had finally claimed mine. I thought about the small moments that had prepared me for this clarity, the evenings spent tracking investments, weekends renovating properties, countless hours at my kitchen table updating spreadsheets, every line verified, every dividend accounted for. Gerald had dismissed it all as inconsequential because he couldn't see the whole picture. He never had, and he never would. A subtle sense of relief washed over me, not triumph, not revenge, but a steady, unwavering acknowledgement. The life I had built was mine, and no one could take it again. For the first time, I could breathe without calculation. I could plan without fear. I could live fully within the boundaries I had set. I glanced at the folder one last time and closed it gently. 11 years of discipline and patience had culminated not in a confrontation of rage, but in the calm assertion of truth. Gerald and Donna Wallace had been confronted with their own actions, exposed and constrained by law, and still, I felt no need for satisfaction. Justice, when it comes quietly, is far more enduring than vengeance. The streetlights outside shifted as the night deepened, and I allowed myself to sit in the quiet knowing that the boundaries were absolute. The studio felt larger, not in space but in freedom. And for the first time, I could imagine tomorrow without fear, without intrusion, and with the certainty that my life, my choices, and my autonomy were fully intact. The following Saturday, sunlight poured through the studio window in a way that made the small apartment feel unexpectedly vast. Ethan was curled up with a book, muttering numbers to himself, and I leaned against the counter, sipping water and thinking about what home meant now. Not the studio, not the houses I rented for investment, but a place I could inhabit fully, without compromise, without ghosts of past manipulations hovering in every corner. For years, the thought of moving had been tangled with anxiety. Gerald and Donna's presence had loomed over every decision. Even when I managed to save, invest, and purchase properties, the possibility of interference always lingered, a quiet tension beneath every choice. Now, with the conservatorship denied, the fraud documented, and legal protections in place, that tension had lifted. I could start envisioning a home of my own making. I pulled out a map and spread it across the kitchen table, marking neighborhoods I had once considered only for investment potential. Now, I looked for light, quiet streets, community parks, spaces where I could grow herbs on a windowsill, a spot for a chair in the sun. The numbers and calculations of investment value were important, but this time the heart mattered more. Ethan peeked over my shoulder. "You actually get to choose, huh? Not for money, not for control, just for you?" I nodded, tracing a potential route through a tree-lined neighborhood. Exactly. No one telling me what's acceptable or expected. No one dictating how I live or what I can do in my own space. This is the first time I'm making decisions purely for myself. He smiled softly, closing his notebook. Feels good, doesn't it? It does, I admitted. Freedom had a new texture, soft and quiet. The studio, small as it was, had been a sanctuary, a command center of autonomy. But this choosing a home I would live in for myself, arranging it around my life, not the manipulation or judgment of others, felt revolutionary. We spent the morning discussing possibilities. Which houses had sunlight in the mornings, which streets were quiet, where small gardens could thrive. It wasn't reckless planning. It was deliberate, mindful, and joyful. Every decision reflected the control I had earned through patience, discipline, and quiet perseverance over the past 11 years. As I stepped onto the balcony to feel the morning air, I realized that the home I was imagining wasn't just a building. It was safety, boundaries, and clarity crystallized. It was a space where autonomy wasn't threatened. A place where life could be lived fully and freely, the way it had always been meant to be. And for the first time in decades, I felt the horizon ahead wide, open, and entirely mine. That afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table with Rachel on a video call, the folder of documents open beside us like an old, trusted companion. The forensic audit, the asset disclosure, property deeds, Vanguard statements, every piece meticulously verified, had already served its purpose in court. But now was the time for permanence, ensuring that Gerald and Donna or anyone else could never touch what was mine again. Rachel guided me step by step. We reviewed powers of attorney, confirming that all revoked authorizations were logged and notarized. We drafted updated directives, clearly assigning authority to trusted professionals only, and ensured that all rental property agreements were legally binding with protections against unauthorized access. I watched her type, noting the precision in every clause, the language that left no ambiguity. Next came the credit freezes. All 3 bureaus were locked, alerts set up for any attempted account creation, and my social security number flagged for additional security. Each step, though technical and deliberate, carried a sense of finality that I hadn't felt before. This wasn't just paper, it was a boundary, living in legal language and enforced by systems I understood and controlled. Ethan sat nearby, quietly observing, occasionally asking questions. So this means even if Dad tried? His voice trailed off. Yes, I said. Even then, nothing moves without my authorization. Every line of defense is now in place. We're not guessing anymore. We're protecting what's ours, with clarity and permanence. I paused, looking out the window at the soft afternoon light across the street. For years, Gerald had taught me that control was wielded through intimidation, through fear, through unspoken power. But the quiet patience of record-keeping, careful planning, and disciplined investment had proved stronger than any loud display of authority. Rachel's voice brought me back. One last thing, she said. Update all contacts, passwords, and notifications. Treat this like a fortress. You've earned this, Thea, and it's time to live without looking over your shoulder. I exhaled slowly, feeling a weight lift from my chest. The apartment, the ledger, the folders, the policies, they were more than tools. They were proof of autonomy, of self-respect, of patience rewarded. I glanced at Ethan, who smiled faintly, a quiet acknowledgement of what we had built together: safety, clarity, and freedom. For the first time, I could feel the peace settle in. Not a dramatic triumph, not a sudden joy, just the calm certainty that boundaries had been established and my life was finally mine. Everything I had worked for, quietly, methodically, over 11 years, was now secured and recognized, not because anyone approved, but because the law and my diligence demanded it. I leaned back in my chair, sipping a cup of water, letting the stillness wash over me. The future felt wide open, deliberate, and mine to navigate, without interference, without fear, and with every boundary firmly in place. Weeks passed, and the studio apartment became a place of quiet rituals rather than tension. Every morning, I opened the blinds to let sunlight spill across the floor, checked the ledger for any updates, and sipped a cup of espresso while Ethan reviewed his notes on investments and properties. The world outside still moved at its usual pace, but inside, boundaries had been drawn and respected. Ethan had started a small plan for his own Vanguard account, guided gently by my explanations. So you're saying I start small, reinvest everything, and let time do the work? He asked, eyes wide with cautious excitement. Yes, I said, smiling faintly. The power isn't in flashy decisions, it's in consistency, patience, and knowing the numbers. You'll make mistakes, but they won't cost you your freedom if you stay diligent. We spent afternoons discussing possibilities for the new home. I was planning a space big enough for a proper kitchen, a small yard for morning coffee, shelves for books and plants, and rooms that felt like they belonged to us. Every detail mattered, from sunlight in the mornings to quiet corners where Ethan could read undisturbed. The process was deliberate, mindful, and deeply comforting. For the first time in years, I could plan without fear, without wondering if every choice would be manipulated, monitored, or undermined. The studio had been my sanctuary, but now I could imagine life beyond it, a life intentionally built, chosen, and lived. I realized freedom wasn't just the absence of interference, it was the presence of control over my own narrative. One evening, Ethan glanced at me, notebook closed, and said softly, "I can't believe how different this feels. Like, we finally get to be ourselves without worrying about them." "Yes," I replied, "and that's exactly why we protect it. Freedom isn't given, it's earned, maintained, and defended with care." The apartment felt lighter, yet fuller. Every ledger, every property deed, every credit freeze, every lock change, all of it formed a framework of quiet security. The past no longer dictated the present. The studio no longer felt small. It felt like a base from which life could expand intentionally, safely, and fully. As I looked around, I realized the clarity I had achieved wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It wasn't about triumph or revenge. It was about reclaiming space, autonomy, and dignity. Gerald and Donna could no longer influence my life, manipulate my decisions, or threaten my autonomy. The court, the law, and my preparation had created an unshakable boundary. And in that quiet apartment, with sunlight on the floor and my brother beside me, I finally understood. The life I had built patiently, silently, deliberately was mine, truly mine. I stood by the window of my studio one quiet evening, watching the sun dip behind the rooftops. 11 years of patience, discipline, and silent work had led to this moment, not triumph or vengeance, but clarity. Gerald and Donna could no longer define my boundaries, touch my life, or dictate my choices. Every ledger, every property deed, every credit freeze was a testament to autonomy reclaimed. Ethan came up beside me, holding a cup of tea. "Feels lighter," he said quietly. I nodded. It wasn't just the freedom from interference. It was the knowledge that our lives were fully ours, built deliberately and defended patiently. The studio, once a small refuge, now felt like a foundation, a starting point for a life fully chosen. I smiled at him, letting the quiet settle around us. Healing, I realized, wasn't loud. It wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about claiming space, preserving dignity, and moving forward without fear. Boundaries were no longer abstract. They were lived, respected, and unbreakable. As the sun disappeared, I whispered to myself and Ethan, "This is ours, and it always will be." If you've ever had to fight quietly for your life, your freedom, or your dignity, share where you're listening from, and stay with us. This space was built for you,